Hello guys, today we will be talking about what if Naruto and Hinata were silent prodigies part 4. If you enjoy this video, please like and subscribe. Now let's begin. We've got company. A ninja with an aging headband emblazoned with the symbol of the hidden mist village announced into his shortwave radio. Hideki was left in charge when Zabuza and the child, Haku, departed no more than half an hour ago. He had not anticipated any trouble, but these were unsure times. I count 3 in Sector 8C, over. Another 3 in Sector 10A. Kaido's voice crackled over the tiny device. I got 3 more in Section 5D. Osamu reported last. Looks like they're headed for the hideout, the temporary head concluded. Each of the identical attackers were in areas directly north of their secluded base of operations, and the masked men's routes would bring them right to the rogue Shinobis's doorstep. He touched his finger to the radio's sender and issued a command. Head back for the base and reinforce the perimeter. We're outnumbered and need to set up an ambush. Come on, Osamu whined, we can take 'em. They're shrimps, shut up and follow orders for once. Fall back now. Hideki exited his cover as quietly as he could and rushed back to the elaborate hut within a minute. There wasn't much time to set up traps, but there was already a perimeter of tripwires, explosive tags, and prime kunai launchers. If the 9 intruders could pass by all that unscathed, then the runaway mist ninjas were in serious trouble. Kaido and Osamu arrived seconds later and took up defensive positions to lie in wait. A handful of 10 seconds passed, the ensuing silence deafening. The calm forest suddenly rumbled to life, and the ground shook as an exploding mark was activated, scorching a small crater into the earth. The sound of swift footsteps was heard cascading from the conflagration before they were cut off by more explosions, and the discernible noise of poison knives flying through the air and impacting soft targets. Well, hell, the leader thought, maybe we don't have to do any fighting at all. His eyes suddenly went wide when his loud subordinate decided he was invincible and stood from his cover. Yeah. Osamu vowed as he brandished his short sword above his head. We got him. The husky man was interrupted by a large shuriken that burst through the dense smoke and struck him in the leg. He cursed as loud as his lungs could exhale as he doubled over in pain and attempted to extract the large blade from his tibia bone when the weapon suddenly glowed with a dozen sparks from explosive tags. Before the man could push his arm forward to free the massive throwing star, the metal exploded in a brilliant flash and showered the Killzone with lumps of charcoaled flesh and bone. Shit. Kaido reeled around to glance at the smokescreen formed by the perimeter's triggered defenses. Were those all decoys? Idiot. Get down. The startled underling failed to obey before a volley of shuriken penetrated the choked battlefield and forced him to maneuver around them, batting any away that came dangerously near his flesh. After a heart-pounding 5 seconds, the barrage wasn't letting up and both men were beginning to worry. As the smoke settled, they instantly saw why up in the trees sat 6 identical crimson-masked men, all flinging every manner of throwing weapons from unseen holsters on their upper arms. Hideki grinned when he saw them kneeling precariously on the limbs of a single tree and began to run his hands through a series of seals. Upon completion, he planted them to the ground, and a surge of chakra snaked through the loose soil and found their way into the roots of the targeted timber. Said tree then appeared to melt as all its sap oozed out in a torrent and hardened to the intensity of steel due to the infused energy. None of the intruders could leap away in time and were caught by the impossibly sticky substance as the missing Miss Shinobi reeled back, then blew a jet of searing flames at them. Their 3 enemies. He heard several pops emanating from the burned limbs, and his eyes glanced back to Finth. Opponents had disappeared into wisps of smoke. Shadow clones, he realized with shock. No bodies were left in the hardened sap, so the real body was still around somewhere. His head shot back and forth in a rising panic to find the remaining opponents. Kaido, he ordered, fall back. Captain, he shouted, they're over. His voice suddenly cut out as a straight blade adorned by an illustrated dance of runes pierced his throat. He fell to his knees as his body became heavy, and his vocal cords gurgled when they became flooded with blood, and his consciousness slipped into darkness for the final time. Hideki witnessed the entire scene with surprise. He had also noticed the remaining enemies moving along the long way and was on the verge of scolding his subordinate for unnecessary speaking when a pair of the identical masked intruders shot out of the ground and killed Kaido. As soon as the underling's warm corpse crashed against the forest floor, one of the men launched the other across the rogue ninja's path, and the sole survivor found himself face to face with a familiar weapon. That's the Demon Brothers' gauntlet, he stated loudly when his eyes locked onto the ring chain that connected the masked pair. He moved his arms down to pull free his custom daggers when the opponents moved with speed that could rival a hurricane. The next instant found the appointed head bound tightly by the bladed chain, ready to be ripped to shreds at the drop of a hat. You the leader here, how? Why are there more of you? He struggled to speak against the lethal binds. How did you do that? He received no verbal answer in reply, but the intruder closest to him pointed up, so he peered up as far as he could without severing an artery. Holy shit, he swore in amazement as a sixth masked man shimmered into view from nothing on top of the highest tree. An Overwatch, you got anything on Gato? The same enemy inquired as he tugged lightly on his heavy claw, cutting the blades ever so slightly into the defeated man's flesh. Hideki coughed as his air was restricted, and he could feel warm blood trickling into the open air. Why yeah, he's got a dock just south of the Wave Country's bridge, where he runs a lot of drugs and stuff. He was about to spill everything he knew when he spotted a pile of logs that was used for firewood several meters away. He began utilizing his chakra in preparation for a body switch, only to have his captors beat him to it and yank back on their chain gauntlets, slicing him to chunks before he could do anything. Anyone else in there? One of the clones shouted at the building to the trio that entered while the recently deceased man was apprehended. Nope, another copy answered. This place is pretty bare. Nothing of any value in here. All right, disperse. The 6 clones puffed out of existence, transferring all their knowledge to the original. Naruto stopped in his tracks as his copy's information was sent back to his mind. He was initially worried when half of his force was wiped away in one fell swoop, but there was nothing left to worry about anymore. Zabuza's hideout was effectively reduced to zilch. He was rushing to the bridge to intercept said ninja at the moment. Not 5 minutes ago, he had dispatched the subpar swordsman sent to deal with Tizuna's daughter and grandson. Now that he was aware of one of the crooked businessman's bases of operation, he knew that he had another excellent opportunity to nip things in the bud. He continued his dead run until he reached the shore. When the bridge came into view, he leapt down to the water and ran his hands through some seals for a technique that he was looking to using. His fingers completed the proper motions and 20 water clones bearing his alter ego's image rose up from the sea. All right, he addressed the small army. You know where to strike. Take out Gato's dock and anyone who resists. Understood? He received 20 masked heads nodding in unison. Good. Dismissed as the clones charged down the shoreline to put distance between themselves and the bridge, the blonde himself continued toward the partially constructed bridge. As he neared, he noticed that Kakashi was occupied with Zabuza, Sakura was standing around doing nothing, and Sasuke was standing between floating slabs of ice. So, I gotta see this, he mused playfully as he charged for the bloodline technique while the original prodigy engaged the ice user. Naruto's water clones ran hell-bent across the deep water to the south in search of the criminal harbor. After a solid 10 minutes of searching, small shacks and ramshackle buildings began to emerge from the foliage opposite the wave's shoreline. Sure enough, there were decent-sized docks with several boats of varying bulk. Most were small 2-person fishing boats, but there was one larger boat and an even larger barge, both of which were pulling away from the harbor. Which should we take? One clone whispered to another as it noticed the vessel splitting up and sailing separate directions. Each sea-bound craft was loaded down with armed men, mercenaries hired by the wealthy Gato. See all those guards? The other copy answered as it nodded towards the rounds of weapon-bearing men on casual patrols around the shoddy structures. They probably get paid well, and there's a lot of them, a third water clone added. Where's that barge going? Another Naruto asked, shifted his gaze between the 2 boats. Looks like towards the town. Probably to circle around and meet up with those other guys. Well, I think the original can handle at least 1 boatload, and we don't know if that barge is really flanking anyone. It could be for the village. All right, the leading clone silenced the hushed discussions. 5 of you go for the barge, and the rest hit the docks. Got it. 19 heads nodded. Good. Go. With that, 20 identical masked geniuses set their attacks in motion. By the time the multiple Uzumakas agreed on a plan, the barge was rounding the shoreline further south. The 5 clones tasked with sinking the vessel gave chase and, upon nearing it, dispersed into the water and nearby foliage behind the sandy beach. The 2 prodigies underneath the waves swam for the hull and latched on while unsealing their custom ninjatos, the seals on the long straight swords capable of wreaking havoc on the basic elements of the metal surface. Two of the 3 Narutos traveling through the trees leapt from the outstretched branches and landed on the crowded deck, steel spears swinging. The pair of water clones was immediately surrounded as they wildly thrust and parried the various weapons of the ill-trained mercenaries, inflicting nothing more serious than mere broken bones and deep lacerations. As the dual masked men created chaos on the deck and promptly attracted the attention of every man on board, the 3rd clone in hiding on the shore charged out onto the water's surface and smiled when it saw the thugs armed with crossbows taking aim inwardly. It ran its hands through a series of seals that were, once again, copied from Zabuza himself. If he wasn't an enemy, it thought, I'd shake his hand and thank him. He completed the appropriate movements and chakra channeled into the water at his feet. The salty liquid began to churn violently and, within a heartbeat, became a raging, rotating torrent that was focused against the barge. The water explosion technique wasn't. The doomed ship was impacted head-on by the massive surge of spinning water, and the deck was rocked fiercely as its inhabitants either clung to the railings for dear life or flew to a watery grave. When the technique ran its course, the vessel was dangerously waterlogged but miraculously afloat. The mercenaries glanced around to find the masked men with the spears standing a good distance away and began frantically bailing the water out. Underneath the flooded barge, the clones glanced at each other, nodded, and then plunged their swords into the hull, penetrating the metal like butter. The seals glowed with extreme intensity as they broke down the elements of the steel into easily destructible materials, and the sea-bound copies anchored their feet to the hull with chakra and ran the length of the ship, slicing out portions that sealed the craft's fate. They released themselves and broke through the surface to watch as the barge succumbed to the sea. The vast majority of the mercenaries clawed at the water as their heavy armor and weaponry weighed them down, and any of them who were capable of staying afloat were eventually sucked beneath the choppy waves as the sinking ship pulled them under its self-induced current. Looks like our work's done here, the clone that initiated the stolen technique stated, before melting into the water and rejoining the sea, immediately followed by its comrades. Gato's drug-running harbor fared no better. The guards were fairly lax when the docks and nearby shacks suddenly burst into flame. When droves of henchmen dashed towards the conflagration to put out the fire, the blonde recognized his enemy from the previous days and didn't feel any real urge to end his life, especially after hearing what he had to say. Haku, unlike a ninja, was overly kind and didn't have an ounce of bloodlust in his body. Even so, he was willing to forsake his own beliefs in order to receive the one thing he truly desired, being needed by someone. Hell, if I knew that, I would have hired him myself, Naruto thought, but despite all that, we're enemies. I've got to do it, he charged and stifled a sigh of relief when the ice user stopped him, and the undercover genius watched the entire scene unfold and added his 2 cents when Haku died before the former mist ninja. He recognized the boatload of mercenaries as the hired thugs piled up on the end of the incomplete bridge and passively observed the Mamachi taking Gato's life in a final act of revenge. When the enemy was mortally wounded and uttered his dying words, the blonde prodigy released tears that his false persona would shed, but felt something akin to sympathy and respect for the deceased. Misguided, yes, he concluded as he sniffled,